Um, yeah, we're going to be getting into a discussion here. This is going to be pretty much our last segment of the workshop. And I know we've mentioned multiple times, even Sam prior to this, how excited we are to have John here with us today, because the Pauline Sabin story is a new one to us at Wolfpack, something we looked into quite a bit when we were examining our organization and figuring out ways that we could improve. And once we realized that organizing was one of the biggest, if not the biggest thing that we missed, Pauline Sabin's story really resonated with us in the way that she approached things and how she got this done. And yeah, at the end of the day, it would be naive of us to not look back at history and learn from the brave men and women who came before us who, were courageous to do these things. Not to mention, do these things at a time where there was no internet and no Zoom meetings, right? We couldn't all get on Zoom all across the country. They quite literally had to physically meet up. So yeah, really excited about this conversation here, John. And what I'll do is I'll grab questions throughout and just try to get you a bunch, hopefully, towards the end. So yeah, without any further ado, let's bring the man on, right?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I mean, it's hard to get opportunities at his story to let you talk for any significant amount of time. So
we were excited.
So I appreciate this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just a very quick sort of a shout out or a caveat or whatever we want to call it. I should mention that while I guess I have a certain expertise related to Pauline Sabin, it's rooted in a book that I co-authored, and really the genesis of that book and sort of the wheel and the whim of it was really conceived by one of my best friends, Hugh Ambrose, who unfortunately passed away during the preparation of the book. But I had done most of the research, and so I completed the writing of it and the promotion of it. But I just always need to make sure that it's clear that I was not a one-man show by any stretch of the imagination. But getting into Pauline Sabin and her involvement in trying to overturn the 18th Amendment, which established prohibition in the United States universally. Just some really quick background on prohibition itself and how it came to be, and then how Pauline came to be, and then we'll get into sort of the mechanism that she created for bringing about its downfall and repeal. And there were other groups, but she and her organization really were the driving force and the consistent force that made that happen. So with regard to prohibition, it had been proposed for probably 75 years before it came to fruition. And when it did, it was viewed significantly as a woman's issue, that this was protecting motherhood and womanliness by eliminating this horrible evil that had set itself upon society, which is also why Pauline Sabin, when she becomes involved, is heavily focused on women as the identity group that she wants to work with, because she believed that if this was set upon women as something for them or benefiting them, it was women who needed to discredit it. But the really key point about prohibition itself is that once the 18th Amendment was ratified and it became the law of the land, the American people had no expectation whatsoever, even up to the last 6 months or so before it was repealed, that it could be repealed and it would not be the law of the land for the rest of their lives, because none of the other amendments had ever been challenged in such a significant way. None had ever been overturned. None had even been considered to be overturned with any significant amount of effort. So there was a deep resignation in the country that this was the way it was going to be. But some of that resided in the fact that 70 to 75% of America was already living under some prohibition legislation, whether it was at the county level or the state level. The majority of Americans already lived in that way. It was really just in the urban areas, but this is a period of transition where America is becoming more urban and less rural. And that in itself feeds a little bit of what Pauline is able to tap into later on, is this changing America. So that's just a little background on Prohibition and sort of where it stands in 1920. In 1920, Pauline Sabin is a political novice, though she had grown up in a political family. Her father had been Secretary of the Navy with Roosevelt back in the 1890s when he was working with President McKinley, and her family had a certain amount of wealth and prestige, and had always occupied various political positions. So she had grown up sort of inside the Beltway, if you will, and understood a little bit about how that world worked. But then she had moved on and married well, as a society girl would, and raised two boys. But something clicked. She was never a suffragette, but because she was fortunate enough most of the time to live in states that had already allowed women to vote, such as in New York, had allowed at least voting on state and local matters for many years before the national amendment that granted the 19th, that granted the vote to women everywhere. But she just decided at some point she needed to be involved in politics, that it just sort of stirred her soul. So she started at the county level in the Republican Party. That was the party of her family, her father, her grandfather, and so on. So it was just a natural place for her. It was also, maybe hard to believe, the Republican Party at that time was the party that had advanced women's suffrage. You might not get that impression today, but in 1920, they were the leading force of that effort. And so once she engaged in politics, she decided she just needed to learn how it worked. You know, how did committees work? How did state conventions? How did delegates get nominated? How did the process work? Because she wanted not so much to elevate herself within the party, but to understand how it worked so she could have greater influence in the party itself. She didn't see herself as ever running for office, but she ended up getting on county boards within the Republican Party, then state delegations at their state nominating and primary conventions and things like that. And she just kept making more and more connections. And the interesting thing is she actually favored prohibition because she viewed it, as many people did, that prohibition, that alcohol consumption and its abuses did damage to the family and to the home. But by 1928, she has something of a revelation. She has an opportunity with one of her Republican clubs to speak to some college students. And she never really said which college it was at, which I think was just her way of being discreet. But one of her friend's children attended the school, and one of the topics of discussion was prohibition. And the students, sort of within this kind of a format that we're doing, in sort of a workshop or discussion group, their only concern about prohibition was whether or not them getting caught drinking, which they admitted they were all doing, would in any way impinge upon their future career prospects. And she was very disturbed that none of them seemed to care that they were actually breaking the law, only that it might have another impact. And so she started talking to her friends, and they ended up having the same kinds of ideas that, yeah, that doesn't, if all we're doing is creating a disrespect for the law on any level, even if the law is right or wrong, this is a significant problem. And so she literally, after one of these meetings with her friends, 8 or 10 ladies at a little tea and crumpet session at her house, decide that they are going to form an organization to bring about the end of prohibition. And that organization, she decides, must have a name that is very clear as to what the intent is. And so it's a very wonky name, it's a very clunky name, but it says everything that she thought people would understand. And that is the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Repeal. So it's an organization for women, organized by women, run by women. It is about national prohibition repeal because Pauline understood, based upon how prohibition had come to be, that there were still these sort of rural or more conservative pockets of the country who might want to retain prohibition on a local level, which remained very true. Actually, the town I lived in did not allow alcohol until 1966. And that was only off sale. We didn't get a bar until 1974. And that was a 3-2 beer bar. And then it was another couple of years before we actually had a full service working bar. So Pauline understood that just asking for it on a national level, the repeal, not insisting that there be or not be prohibition, but repealing the national law would then allow local and state control, which was all she was asking for. So, like I said, the name's a little wonky and long, but it stated everything that she needed to, and felt that it got their message across very simply from the get-go. Once they had decided upon the name, which was the very first thing they did what I would term a grassroots campaign in reverse. So usually a grassroots campaign means that you're starting at the most basic level, in your local communities, neighborhoods, and then up to maybe the city level, and then the county level, and then state. You just kind of build from the bottom up. Well, she did it in reverse, but it was still a very much grassroots effort, in the sense that it started with her political connections and her friends and her garden club and so on. And she had, in the early 20s, had established a group called the Women's National Republican Club, which was housed in New York City and still maintains the same headquarters that it did in 1923 when it was founded. So this is their anniversary year. But it was very much centered in the East at that time. And so she had a lot of connections based upon that, and her social connections over the years. And so she just sort of sent the word out among her friends and her associates and her political connections that they were forming this organization. And then, before she sort of set them to the task of working downward, or grassroots in reverse, she made it very clear that, again, what they were about was repeal. And the reason that they wanted repeal was this thing she had discovered when talking to the college students, that there was this emerging disrespect for the law that had led so far that it had created these massive crime syndicates. And at the same time, the creation of the law and all the accompanying legislation that was required to put the law into effect and enforcement had created a huge, in her mind, trampling of civil rights. And at that point, she raised something that had been discussed mildly, but no one had really talked about a lot, which was that the 18th Amendment establishing prohibition was the only one that took rights from people. Every other amendment had offered rights or freedoms or protections to their rights, as outlined in the Constitution. And so she said, we're not going to talk about whether or not prohibition and alcohol consumption are right or wrong or any of that. We're only going to talk about what's being denied in terms of our constitutional freedoms and whether that's right or wrong. And so she had sort of developed this philosophy at the same time that was expressed in that name of the organization: unified and simple messaging. Here's who we are, and then here's what we're trying to accomplish. And it has nothing to do with the original intent of prohibition. It has to do with what has been affected by it. And then her second kind of component or philosophy at the time was approaching any either potential member of their organization or anyone who they might speak to with understanding, acknowledgement of their concerns or issues, even if they didn't agree or disagree, and always attempting to find common ground. And that would be a keystone of the entire movement, was, again, trying to focus upon what are the things that we both care about, and how is this law damaging that? And that was a very effective tool. And then the other thing was, she got a lot of criticism for becoming a single issue advocate or politician. And in her mind, and in the philosophy that she spread to the growing membership of this organization, was prohibition was not a single issue because it did trample on civil rights. It did not achieve the goals that it aimed to. It created more lawlessness and these massive crime syndicates, and led to the formation of the first federal police force, and made so-called ordinary citizens into criminals for very simple acts of having a drink. And so she kept stressing that these common themes were common places for discussion, and for people even of varying views, even if they still believed liquor was immorally wrong, or liquor consumption immorally wrong, they could agree and find common ground on these other points. So when she switched to the so-called single issue, she quickly turned around and said it's not a single issue because it affects all these other things. And one of the other ones that became sort of a big issue among men when they started to grow the organization later, men never joined, but they certainly became allied with certain men's groups, was that there was a massive reduction in tax revenues, which in the middle now of a depression at this time, we're into past 1929, that it was greatly harming the economy further than what the economic displacement of workers and capital and all that had done. And so, again, she kept stressing things other than the reasons prohibition had been put into place. So, sorry, I have to flip through my notes here once in a while to make sure I didn't forget something. Yeah, and then the other thing would have been just the fairness of the law, applying the same law to everybody with different values, different heritage, different experiences across the board, created huge inequities. So along with sort of the violation of civil rights was this idea that this is inequitable amongst a wide variety of people. So she came up with the plan. It started with sort of this, as I said, grassroots and reverse idea, the simplification of a name that explained who and what they were and how they might progress. But then she kept adding sort of layers to it. And the first layer was before sort of sending people out to start establishing, local and state chapters, she held a huge meeting in Chicago in 1929 where it was basically exactly what you guys have been doing this weekend, is educating people on what the law was, what were the arguments against the law, and how might we change the law. And from that very first large meeting, which was attended by a few hundred women, most of whom knew Pauline personally or were sort of friend of a friend, but very eager to involve themselves. From that very first meeting, she said, we will be pursuing an amendment. You had to get an amendment to repeal the amendment. And so she said, we'll get an amendment, but we will be asking for state conventions. And that was the first time anybody had ever really proposed that idea, because it had always seemed very clunky. So until that point in time, every amendment and every proposed amendment had been approved by state legislatures. So Congress would say, yes, we're going to allow this amendment be sent to the states for ratification, which required 3/4 of all the states at the point in time that the amendment was passed, typically with a 7-year sunset provision for getting it done. But it went to state legislatures for their consideration and vote. And Pauline had determined, having been an insider, if you will, in the Republican Party, that state legislatures and legislators were very heavily influenced by what we would now call lobbying groups. They didn't really refer to themselves that way at the time. They didn't even really refer to them as special interest groups. But there were these people who hung around and said, hey, how about if I let you use my lake house for a week, kind of thing, and you maybe either vote this way or that way on an issue, or maybe we'll help you out with your campaign if you do this or that. So lobbying at that time was much more heavily done in the state legislatures. It was starting to be done more at the national level, but there had been a network that had developed over the years of special interests who worked in state legislatures sort of under lobbying efforts, because until 1916, all U.S. senators were elected by state legislators. So it was, very important, to form national policy through the Senate by controlling who got into the Senate. Well, in 1916, there's an amendment to the Constitution that provides for direct election of senators by popular vote. So they lose a little influence in the state houses, but those lobbying groups or individuals are still sort of hanging around. So Pauline had seen this in her years of education within the Republican Party and decided, we don't want to mess with the legislatures because we know how sort of easily influenced or swayed they can be by these moneyed interests that are kind of trolling the hallways and offices in those state capitals. And so she says, we're going to go the convention route. And of course, since it had never been tried, everyone sort of blankly looks at her and asks, how do we do that? And so, she much like you guys are doing, brought in sort of a constitutional expert who very basically explained it's the same process. You still get Congress to approve an amendment be sent out to the states for ratification, and it's still 3/4 of all states must approve. But what you do is you hold a special convention. So you have a special election to elect the delegates who will go to the state convention. And then they basically have some discussion. It usually doesn't last too long. It's a day or two. And then they decide up or down, will we support this amendment? And so everybody thought that was a great idea. And the greatest aspect of the idea was that Pauline and Whomper could take that idea to state legislators and then to federal legislators and say, we're not going to ask you your feelings on prohibition or the law itself. We're going to ask you, would you permit the American people to decide the fate of prohibition? And that was a very difficult thing for any legislator at any level of government to deny, to say, no, I don't think the American people should have a vote. I'm their vote, and so she was very shrewd in having figured that out. And someone else had sort of, a colleague who was a U.S. Senator, James Wadsworth from New York, had sort of turned her on to this idea. He had tried to get an amendment of his own passed a few years previous to that effect, that simply it would require state conventions be held after every election in which sort of the political makeup of a state legislature changed after the election for national offices. It was very complicated and confusing, but his thought was that, you've changed the makeup of your political or of your congressional people. And so since that was voted by the people, should the state legislature really have the involvement of selecting who was who and how it works? It was very complicated, but the essence was that the way to bypass all that was state conventions. So that's what Pauline decides upon. And so part of this educational process at that very first convention is to explain how that would work. So it was about, here's our arguments against, and here is what we're asking, which is really just, can we vote on it? Not even arguing whether or not it's right, wrong, or the other, or are there other options, just can we vote on it? And here's how we would do it. So there's this massive, sort of effort in the first 6 to 12 months where all they're doing is educating themselves on how the process works. Then once they've understood that process, excuse me, then it's time to go out and sort of form our organizations. And so again, it kind of starts from this top down. It's like they'll allow anything to be formed, but Pauline says, we need to have somebody in every single state so that if there's a question, we have that expert. You were just here and you learned all about it. Now you're going to go back to Texas and you're going to be our expert, if you will, in that state. And then you're going to start to sort of build your network from the people at the garden club and in your local parties and so on and so forth. And then sort of it was almost like a pyramid scheme, working from the top down, where you just keep feeding that education and experience to new members, and you keep placing things in very simplified messaging, that it's really about, is this law making society any better? Did it really have its intended effects? And at the same time, we can see that it had the opposite effect, especially in the trampling of civil rights and in fairness. So like I said, it's this whole grassroots and reverse campaign. And then the other big component of that is that even though Pauline was Republican, she had been going to Democratic events for years because her husband was a Democrat. And so she believed that none of the members of WAMPR in building this organization should ever talk about which party they belonged to, or if one party was more helpful or useful than another. They wanted to be totally nonpartisan and at the same time non-confrontational. They would take meetings or appear at meetings or talk to newspaper editors or magazine publishers of any political stripe in a non-confrontational way. And if some of those people might try and goad them into becoming more partisan or confrontational, the women would just say, well, here's our position, and that would be it. And they would just keep, that was the beauty of this very simplified message, that we're just asking for repeal and that Americans get to decide on that issue. Here's our arguments why we think it should be repealed, but it's really about giving us the right to make the decision. And so that was that really, once that became known, that sort of journalists and newspapermen, because that was really the prime way of getting your information out. And then sort of they catch the wave of an emerging growth in radio at this time. It's really sort of a new thing, but they, appear on programs, whether it's just your local, like we would call it today, the local morning show or something. But, they would take any opportunity, and it became sort of this fascination, which Pauline knew it would, that these women, it was almost treated jokingly at first. Oh, these women are actually going to somehow organize and form. And this idea that women, brought prohibition into being, why would they ever oppose it? And this is just some rich old ladies who, want to have their cocktails at 4 every day kind of thing. So that led to the next step, that Pauline said, we have to get women of every background, rich, poor, blue collar, white collar, maids. We want the maid in the house with the rich woman, both WAMPR members, because this issue affects them equally. That status didn't matter. And it didn't matter if you were, not that there were a lot of them, but, if you were a female doctor or lawyer, again, you were equally affected by this as the housewife was. And it was important that every region of the country be represented. So within about a year and a half, they have state chapters in every single state. And they have then kind of the spider web falling down from there of, local, county and local, and even neighborhood organizations that belong to WAMPR. And the national organization is just preaching the same thing, just educate them on the same basic message, on the process for getting this changed, and the basic reasons why it needs to be changed. And that we really, all we want is the opportunity to ask the question of Americans and let them decide. And in the back of her mind, Pauline suspected that Americans would say, yeah, we're done. We don't want it anymore. But they just kept preaching those same things over and over and over again. So the organization just keeps growing and growing and growing. And it becomes, at first, as I said, for sort of the media, it's sort of this jokey thing. But then when they start seeing that all of a sudden it's, 300,000 members in 6 months, and it's 500,000 3 months later, and it's 1 million within a year, it becomes less of a joke. And they're starting now to talk to state legislators. How do you feel about the issue of prohibition? Would you allow a vote? How do you feel about it? And slowly starting to change over some of those people, because then they institute now that we're all educated, the policy is you will only vote for somebody who opposes or who supports a vote on prohibition and its repeal. And if there's two candidates and they both support it, then you can, vote the party line if you want. But that party, to truly be nonpartisan, we are not going to involve ourselves in one side or the other. It's like, so in the end, jumping just a little bit ahead, in 1932, Pauline, lifelong Republican, still a Republican, appears at the 1932 Democratic nominating convention endorsing Franklin Roosevelt, someone with whom she would never have voted for, given her conservative upbringing and interests, but he was willing to support a vote of the people on this issue. And so that's all she cared about. Herbert Hoover, the Republican candidate, would not. And so she was sort of showing her brethren. It's like, I'm not just saying these things, I'm actually doing them. And there's I can't call it famous because it's a bit of an obscure event, but there was a photo taken of Pauline with Al Smith, who the one-time Democratic presidential candidate, and another gentleman who was the head of the Democratic National Committee, and it was in papers all over the country. And it just sort of threw back in their face all the critics who said, that she's just sort of doing this, sort of for her own self-aggrandizement, and this isn't really a real thing. But it also then showed all these women who had been following her, this is real, she's serious, this is a big deal. And so the membership even blossoms more after this. So that was jumping ahead a little. But so then, again, she has this very specific plan how we do it. We educate ourselves, then we fan out, then we get attention, we fan out some more. And in the process, we also identify voters who are being underserved. Well, since women nationally had only had suffrage for 11, 12 years at this point, they're her most natural group. But she says, we're not going to expand membership beyond women because that's just that holds our identity. We are going to start to form alliances with other groups who have the same interest as we do. And we're going to find out, are they registered? Who are their representatives? How can they influence those own things? How can those groups, appear at the same events we are, or follow us on radio programs with the same messaging? So she's very shrewd about continuing to just kind of build, now these satellite and allied organizations and affiliations. And in her case, she starts with some of the most obvious, and again, she gets criticism, but they make the most sense. They're in the middle of a depression, and there's still thousands and thousands of workers who had worked in distilleries and breweries and bars and restaurants and hotels that never got their jobs back. One, because prohibition came in, and then the depression followed not that long afterwards. And so they're natural allies, and some of them have different reasons for why they're allies, but they coalesce around this idea of allowing Americans to decide for themselves whether or not this should exist. So again, she's really smart about how she does it. Well, by this time, there's a commission that was formed to study whether or not prohibition had the desired effect. It was called the Wickersham Commission. And Pauline knew Mr. Wickersham from years in Republican politics. And so he was able to sort of, even in advance of the final report, provide her statistics on what were the effects of prohibition. And most of the statistics dealt with the massive, massive increase in crime. And not just crime, like, okay, obviously we have all these people who are being picked up for small-time liquor violations, but the massive crime syndicates that have formed, and the number of assaults and murders and burglaries and so on that are associated with this illegal liquor trade. And so that becomes another sort of part of the message is, it's like, again, this didn't have the desired effect. It's not a question of whether, alcohol consumption is a moral right or wrong. This isn't working. Things are getting worse. Crime is worse and worse, and this sort of, again, protecting motherhood. If the idea was that prohibition would protect motherhood and the home, it's like it's become less safe. They start to present images of mothers escorting their children to school and, bootleggers hiding behind mailboxes kind of thing, to just sort of drive home the idea that we're not any safer anymore. If that was the goal, we're not any safer. So that becomes just another part of the message. Is like, we want to demonstrate that it doesn't matter what it was about. It's not working. So then sort of the next step is, now they've got the facts. Now everybody's educated. Now everybody within the organization can speak well. They're nationally recognized. They're constantly in the paper somewhere for some event that they're holding, whether it's Poughkeepsie, New York, or Eagles Pass, Texas. There something is always in the paper about WAMPR and this organization and what they're doing. So they take a bold move in 1931, and they send a survey to all the U.S. senators and congressmen, and they ask them simply, will you allow a vote by the American people on this issue? Doesn't ask whether or not they favor prohibition or don't favor prohibition. It just says, would you allow the American people to decide? And as she had told everyone when she started the organization in 1928, that was going to be a difficult question for anybody to say no to. Now, obviously, it meant there was still the hurdles of getting to that point, but the survey results were pretty overwhelming. There were, it was like 80% said that they would not stop a vote by the American people in state conventions if it got to that point. And the 20% who said they wouldn't, basically their reasoning was, this has already been decided. The idea that it's an amendment to the Constitution. It's there forever. We don't monkey with that, despite the fact that there is a mechanism for doing so. So once she had the results of that survey, it allowed them to do two things. It allowed to go to the 80% and say, will you hold to this? Two, will you be an actual advocate for us on this issue? And three, would you sort of talk to your your fellow congressmen or senators? Would you talk to local legislatures at the state level? Because they would be needed once an amendment was passed to sort of set these conventions up. And so there's also sort of I wouldn't say a mad scramble, but as WAMPR starts to get more influence, and after this poll comes out, a lot of states didn't have a real clear formula for holding state conventions because they had never really thought this would happen. And so there's like a basic outline of things. So a lot of states start trying to figure out, well, how would we do that? How would we hold these conventions? And again, Pauline knew that this was going to happen. And so she has sort of the administrative staff of WAMPR start assessing every single state. What is their mechanism for establishing a state convention? Because it was almost different in every single state in terms of how would you have to, first and foremost, you have to set a date for when the convention would be held. How are delegates selected for the election? Is it by, anybody can get on with a certain number of names on a petition? Is there a caucusing, aspect to nominating delegates? How many do we have from our state? How are they decided? Is it by sort of state congressional districts, or is it by some other method that we decided? So Pauline and WAMPR are studying that at the same time a lot of it's being formed. So again, they already know before they've gotten to the process how this is going to work once they can get down the road. So they've advertised the results. They're targeting those who support them, and then they're also targeting those who oppose just simply the idea of allowing a vote. So in the 32 elections, congressional elections, Wamper is out in force just saying these people won't even allow you a vote. It's not even, again, about right or wrong. They won't allow you a vote. And they have a huge success in flipping out in those state legislators a lot of those people, because again, they need a certain assistance once they get to the state convention level in organizing these things from the state legislature. So sort of one of the final components in all this is they've sort of identified some of these groups that they can form with and have alliances with, but there's one big one that they won't. And this is kind of key as well, is Pauline knowing which groups serve them best in advancing their simple messaging and which don't. So her husband happened to be a member of a group called the Association against the Prohibition Amendment, the AAPA. And they had been around since 1920. But their problem was they were dominated by, for lack of a better word, a cabal of rich industrialists and wealthy men. And their main complaint against the Prohibition Amendment was taxes. Their taxes all went up because the federal government lost the tax revenue that they used to get or collect from the manufacture and sale of liquor. And so they come to be viewed as just these, sort of, mean old men who just wanted more money. And so even though Pauline's husband served on the board of the AAPA, he didn't want any association, at least publicly, with them. They did take some money, some donations from them, sort of anonymously from the AAPA, but she didn't want to associate with them because they had left such a bad taste in most of the American public's mind that, that they were only serving themselves under one purpose. So, she's willing to work with a lot of different groups so long as it's that same simple messaging that prohibition doesn't work for us. It had, an undesired effect, and we insist that, we have the right to at least a public mandate on this. But it's interesting that, she's in the same house with somebody who she can't necessarily align with. So all of this education and expansion of membership and public exposure and advertising, certainly they have, sort of what we would call today a marketing campaign, buttons and banners and posters and all this kind of thing, that they're distributing and people are wearing and displaying around the country in their local chapters, culminates in what they term National Reform Week. And it's in 1932. It's before the 32 congressional election. And it's all about just, again, educating everybody who's not in the organization about who Wamper is and what they're asking for and why they're asking for it. And in that effort, then they allow all these sort of aligned groups, I can't remember their name, but basically the Union of Hoteliers and Restaurateurs who, obviously would like to be able to sell liquor in their establishments again. They're doing their events during this week, and they're going up to every state capital legislature that's in session and, meeting with representatives. They're going to Capitol Hill in DC and doing the same thing. There are radio addresses across the country from different leaders and women in the movement. And so it's just sort of, now it's like, they've sort of gotten all their ducks in a row within their organization. Now they're just blowing it out to the world. And as I said, it has this huge effect on the 32 elections, both at the state level and the national level. And so, and at the same time, Mr. Roosevelt becomes president. And he hasn't really said much about his feelings. He's known to be a drinker himself. But Roosevelt always tried to follow the political winds. And so he's elected. He sees the change within the two houses of Congress and within the states in this massive movement that Pauline has put together, and seems to suggest that, okay, I would, I'll allow a vote. He still doesn't want to fully commit. He wants it to be the people's choice, which is very shrewd on his part to not get bogged down too much in it, because he really has no effect on whether the law would be repealed or not. He has no say in it whatsoever, and neither does anyone in his administration or the executive branch of government. So he kind of hangs aloof, but then he does a couple of things that suggest there's change. And then through all of these political associations that Pauline had established, steps forward John Blaine of Wisconsin, a senator who was a lame duck. He was not reelected, but at that time, you have that lame duck period until there's the change. So he proposes what at the moment was just simply known as the Blaine Amendment, to allow for a vote, a national vote through state conventions, on whether or not this law should be repealed. And he has the support of Wamper because they feel that there are enough people now in both houses that the amendment will get passed, and then sent out to the states for full ratification if that's possible. So the bill goes through a few changes and this and that, and people keep proposing compromises. And Wamper keeps pressuring Blaine and others and saying, no compromise, a simple vote on whether this should be repealed, no other parameters. Because once it's gone, then states can decide and localities can decide what they want. But it's like, we're not compromising on, oh, well, we'll do a little bit of it, or we'll just do it in this way, or, we'll sell 3-2 beer or whatever. It's like, no, it's just repeal, period. And then states can figure out what they want to do. So it bounces around a little, but then it passes. So then there's this, furious activity from all of the states on what do we do? And one of the things that Pauline had prepared her membership for was the fact that a lot of the states did not have their legislatures meet continuously. And that's still true in a lot of states today. I live in Colorado. Our state legislature, unless a special session is called, only meets for 120 days each year. And when I lived in Montana, this is 20 some years ago, I don't know if this is still the case there, but their state legislature only met every 2 years. And with, again, very specific dates on which they met. And then unless the governor could somehow extract a special session under special circumstances, they're gone. And you don't see them again for a year, or in the case of Montana, back in the day, for 2 years. But Pauline had developed a schedule. She knew when every single state legislature met, what their recesses and breaks were. She knew who controlled the rules committees and the ways and means committees in those respective state legislatures, so that once this amendment, the Blaine Amendment, became the Blaine Act, was passed and the amendment was sent out, they were given 7 years, but Wamper and Pauline felt, we want to strike while the iron is hot. We've had lots of great publicity. We've got a national campaign. People recognize what we're trying to do. We want these conventions to happen immediately. So she had already, while Blaine was bouncing his bill around from the House to the Senate and, getting sort of amendments taken in and out of it before it's passed, Pauline is already sort of through her network to the state organization said, you need to already be in touch with your state legislatures and find out exactly when they're meeting and how soon we can get this, put before them. Because now that, so that once the Blaine Amendment is passed, and it's basically like, okay, it's up to the states now, the Congress is out of the picture now. Each state has to set their own state convention. And as I said, they have different means of how they do that and how delegates are selected. But immediately Pauline's on it. It's like, okay, so they whatever, just randomly. Utah starts their session doesn't start till August 8th or something. So let's make sure we get on their calendar on day one when they're out there. But I know, Rhode Island, for example, starts, February 1st. So it's like, we got to get out there right away kind of thing. But she's already got that all mapped out. She's already, over these years, her organization has mapped out who do we talk to get this done. And each state legislature is required to address this issue. They're not required to do it immediately. As I said, they have 7 years. They could have just said, we're not doing this. But the network that Wamper had built had already advanced it. And once it was put to a vote, just like the surveys and everything else, legislators were very resistant, no matter what they thought about the issue, to say, no, I'm not going to allow my constituents to vote on this, because that might mean they were going to get turned out of office the next time around, because someone's going to say, you're not even going to let me have a say in it. You're just going to decide for me. You don't represent everything I care for, kind of thing. And so Pauline had known this all along, that she was going to catch all these legislators in a conundrum. It's like, they may oppose changing the law and repealing prohibition, but there was no way they were going to tell their constituents they aren't allowed a say in it. They were just going to keep their fingers crossed that the state conventions, would elect delegates who would then vote against this new amendment. Excuse me. So basically, Pauline and her organization have set up a timetable of like, here's when each state is meeting. Here are the people we've established contacts with. Let's get this going. And when we have them submit the bill to set a state convention, let's have them put a date on it. Let's not have them just say, oh, we'll do it sometime in the next year or something. But let's have them set something, 3 months ahead of, this vote that they're having for it, or, whatever it is. And again, they had already done the work of making sure that Wamper understood and that the state legislators understood what the process was for assigning delegates. And at the same time, Wamper had, over the years, just been collecting who would be good delegates. Some states didn't allow legislators to be a delegate to a state convention. Some did. It just varied greatly. But they had been identifying, Wamper and Pauline, who would be good delegates, who would be in our favor, who are allies, so that as soon as the Blaine Act is sent out to the states, they've already got a slate of candidates. Wherever the state is, it's like, okay, here's the 20 people we want, we're going to put on the ballot as a delegate to these state conventions. And so, amazingly, the Blaine Act is passed. I think it's signed in February of 1933, February, March. I don't know why I didn't write that down. But anyways, these state conventions just start going like that because of all the groundwork that Wamper and Sabin had done. I mean, they start happening within months. I mean, it's like every other week, there's another state convention. So just as with passing the amendment, you have to have a new amendment. You can't just reject the old one. So it's like, even though you're asking for repeal of the amendment, you still have to get 3/4 of all the states to agree to repeal. It's not as if you can just say, oh, we only need to get, 1/4 and 1 extra, because that would refute the earlier. You still have to get 3/4. So the other thing that Pauline and her group had done is, as just about any political organization would do, is, here are the states that we feel are solid for us. Here are the states that we know are definitely against us. And here are the states in the middle. And obviously where they're focusing their efforts are on the states in the middle, the ones that they're not sure about. And they still, in every sort of analysis, they're kind of, at that point, they needed 36 states. There were 48 total states at that time. And they keep coming up around 34, and they're like, oh my gosh, how are we going to do this? But they're not going to back off. They're like, we want these things to happen. Because even though you have a vote, if it fails, you can come back to it as many times as you want in that 7-year period that you have to get this passed. But you also have to allow it, you're enabling sort of vote from the state legislature has to say how long that vote counts. And this is something that happened years later when they were trying to pass the Equal Rights Amendment in the 70s and the 80s. Was some states would say, okay, yeah, you approved that amendment, but that vote only counts for a year, 2 years, maybe not the full 7 years, because situations change. And so that was the other reason why Pauline wanted to do this all at once. So it's like, now we'll know whether we got it or not. And then if we don't, then we still have 6 more years to try and regroup and do this again and make sure we get it right. So anyways, there's just a flurry of these state conventions. And as I said, some of it took some real maneuvering because several state legislatures weren't even in session. But they either waited upon those and had them prioritized and organized, or they were able to call special sessions. And so they happened so fast that by August already, Pauline is pretty certain that they're going to get what they want. And then the final surprise is that she gets it 2 months sooner than she had expected, because Utah, a state that they had never counted in the For Us column, voted to repeal national prohibition. And so literally the day after that vote, it's done. Everything is dismantled in terms of the legislation that and enforcement, which left some big issues for the Bureau of Prohibition and at the federal level and things like that. But yeah, it essentially, once the amendments passed, there isn't necessarily like, okay, now we need to do this, because all they asked was that it not exist anymore, that it not be a crime, that there were no penalties assessed to it. So it didn't require any mechanism to put it in place. And that was, again, part of where she started from, is we're just asking to reclaim freedoms and rights that we always had before. And so there isn't, once you take away what was prohibiting those, you don't need to reestablish anything new. So yeah, so they just had a big party. And we don't know, it's funny, I found a copy of the menu for the party. It's very elaborate, very delightful, but it doesn't state whether or not the alcohol was served at the party, which I always thought was kind of funny. But to kind of summarize sort of the plan and approach that she took on its most basic level, and it really was, she obviously had very able people assisting her, and very devoted and passionate people at the state and local and neighborhood levels, and was an excellent communicator in establishing these alliances. But it really was all Pauline. I mean, she's the one. No one else has even got a thought in 1928 when she establishes WAMPR, how this is going to happen, or that it would even be possible. As I said, no amendment had ever been overturned. And given the number of dry counties and dry states across America, it did seem like an impossible task. But again, she had educated herself on political process, and that's how she was going to approach it. Was we're gonna educate ourselves and learn how this is possible, and then we're going to throw that message out there, and we're going to keep it very simple. So one of the cornerstones of success obviously was the state convention route. It had never been tried. It had never been believed that it could even be pulled off, and it certainly didn't. No one believed it could be pulled off in 7 months. That you could actually have 36 state conventions in a 7-month period after the Blaine Act was sent out to the states for approval or denial. So that was a huge, huge element in the success. The other was just the very, very focused message on, it's not about what the law is about. It's about whether or not we had our rights or our freedoms compromised by the existence of this law. Because people could understand that from any political spectrum, from any economic background, from any social strata. If you tell people you had their freedoms taken away from them, and you have a very simple way of explaining it, they'll see it. And she knew that. Again, that was part of her genius, was just breaking it down to the most simplified element and just hammering at it, never really adjusting it. It's like, There might be small tweaks because it affects this group this way, slightly different. But if your freedom is taken away from you or rights are restricted or curbed, it's the same for everybody. It doesn't vary because of who you are or what group you belong to. And then another big element was that whole idea that, she knew that politicians, more than anything, want to keep their jobs. And issues become very secondary to that matter. And so that's why she kept pressing the message of, we're just going to ask people, politicians, leaders, industrialists, will you allow the American people the right to make their own decision on this? And as I said several times, that's such a huge message, because people are just not, as soon as you say no, I don't give a damn what you say, even though you're my constituent, you've pretty much guaranteed you just lost the next election, especially in this time period when media, I don't want to say it was controlled, but as an example, New York City, I think, had 7 or 8 newspapers at that time, and they were all had a slightly different political bent and perhaps even tailored themselves a little bit, maybe one more to labor versus management and those kinds of things. And so the news that you read it's kind of like when someone decides today, and I know I've stressed that, being nonpartisan is a big deal, but it's kind of like if I only watch Fox, or I only watch MSN, or I only watch, Newsmax or News Nation or something. It's the same thing that they experience, even though they're only getting it in newspapers. You only buy one newspaper, so you pick the newspaper that most fits your political stripe and your sort of economic social strata. It answers that for you. And she knew, again, that, like, remove that element. Just ask, are people allowed to make decisions for themselves? Yeah, we elect representatives, but this is a bigger issue. Are you going to let us make a decision on it? And down the line, politicians just were too precious of their jobs to ever say no, at least in great numbers. And that goes back to just, presenting it as a nonpartisan thing and remaining non-confrontational. I'm not going to ask you to defend a position. I'm not going to ask you to say yes or no to prohibition. I'm just going to ask you, don't you think it's appropriate the American people get to decide something for themselves once in a while? So that was kind of it in summary. My favorite thing that Sabin ever found that I've said that I could find, because there's a lot of public statements, but she did not retain a lot of private papers, so we don't know much beyond that. But there's a pretty good wealth of stuff with the papers of Wamper, and obviously all the public pronouncements and radio addresses. And she's even was in a couple of newsreels from that era. So we know what she said. But the favorite thing I ever found was in describing what they were trying to do, and why it was necessary, was it's time to end the hypocrisy that is becoming our national characteristic. And again, that does not address the actual issue at hand. It just addresses that, the issue of, we won't let people decide for themselves, or we're going to claim that this is good for you, but then we're going to take away your rights. It's just a very broad statement. And that's how she always operated, is I'm just going to work broadly and in broad statements and broad context. And that's why they had such success. So, how this translates for Wolfpack in your efforts, I think it's brilliant to look at the option of state conventions. Obviously, you need to identify if you were going to follow the Sabin model, a very specific sort of goal and message that's very simple, that appeals not so much to how do I phrase it? You need to appeal, if you're following her model, to what is being taken away from you, or what did you lose by virtue of things like Citizens United, without getting too much into how are things right or wrong. But this is the impact it's had. Do you believe that that's fair? Is that equitable? Because that's essentially the question she kept asking over and over again was, you know, so, she identified the freedom or the rights that had been taken from them and what she wanted restored. And then they just kept hammering and hammering and hammering. And then within that, then actually providing the statistics on how things had changed since the initiation of prohibition. Did it, have its desired effect or not? And she was able to show not. Again, without getting into moral arguments, because that's what people always viewed the law as relating to. And then sort of, if I had to apply it to what you all are doing, which I very much support, it's just some of it's very simple. Like you're battling the idea that money is free speech. To me, that's a slogan right there. It's like, is money free speech? And when I was going through my notes, and I must have written this somewhere when I was doing research on the book several years ago. I wrote a quote from Lincoln, which I didn't use in the book, but it made me think, could someone like Abraham Lincoln even get elected today? I mean, he was broke all the time. He had lost the only election he'd ever been in. He wasn't particularly successful even as a lawyer. So if you were looking at groups who finance candidates and issues, if you looked at and he's not appealing to the eye, he doesn't have a cachet as a heartthrob or anything. He's not a John F. Kennedy or something. You would look at him and say, he's not very marketable. He's not, I don't see, no matter how much money we throw at it, I don't see that. And he would be someone who would have to, in our day and age, get lots and lots of money to convince you that he was better than what appeared on the page or in a picture. And what a loss that would have been to have not had someone like that. So I don't know. It was just something I thought of. It was interesting to me. And then just the last two things, and then I'll let you throw a bunch of questions at me. I don't know exactly when this happened, but at some point, the Women's Organization for National Prohibition and Repeal was reestablished, because when they had the big party when repeal occurred, Pauline basically said, well, our work's done, ladies. You can go back to your lives. Thank you, kind of thing. And it was sort of dissolved. But somewhere along the way, it reformed, and now it does a lot of work on they have the same name, and their issues that they address are involved with other forms of prohibition, whether it's restrictions on LGBTQ plus communities or free speech issues. I don't know if they've involved themselves in campaign finance reform or ideas about that, but they have a much broader canvas that they work for. And so, as you get down the road and you're looking for your allies, I think that would be fabulous if you were able to make that or reestablish those kinds of connections with that group. And then the book that I wrote, that I pulled all this information from, obviously, I don't go a lot into necessarily the constitutional details and mechanisms of this. It was really more about Pauline's philosophy and plan and strategy. But there are a couple other books out there that, if you're interested, I could put you to, that do include a little bit more of sort of the, not quite day-to-day mechanism of how she and the organization worked, but probably a bit more than what my book provided, because mine had a broader canvas than just Pauline. But yeah, if you're interested, I can pass that information along. But I think that's my spiel. I hope it was helpful and useful, and I'm ready for any questions you might have.
I was going to type this, John, but I figured I'm going to come on anyway. So I'm just going to speak for everybody and say, I think we would be very interested in that information.
Okay.
All right.
Yes.
Awesome. That was fantastic, man. I really appreciate it, especially just us to, like, during the committee process that we put here at Wolfpack to kind of re-examine everything and make sure we're on the right track. That's when we learned about Pauline Sabin's story and introduced it into our own theory of change.
Mm.
And yeah, like I said earlier, not to be cliche or anything, but if you're in the business of trying to change things and win, it would be, organizing malpractice to not look back at history and how it was actually accomplished before in the past.
When you just reminded me of another, you know, potential ally or another source to examine. I Pauline, there is a, I don't know if they still do it, the Pauline Sabin Award given out by, I want to say by NARAL, NARAL, the um, used to be the marijuana lobby. I don't know if it's much different now, but yeah, they used to give an award, and it was based upon, her basic premise that, any sort of denial or restrictions upon civil rights or our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms is a problem. And again, they use her as an example in the same way that I have. It's not about the actual act or law. It's just like, if you take something away from somebody that I was told I have, that's wrong. So again, another potential source for you guys to dig into if you have time and interest.
Absolutely. All right, we got quite a bit here. I think what we're going to do is break them up. I'll probably take a few, and then we have Sam and Sammy, who have been running the stream here, who will also jump in with some questions as well.
Okay.
Open them up. Some of these you may have already answered, John. So if you wanted to just add anything, or if not, we can definitely just skip over them.
Yeah.
So the first one here is Gen Z being the largest voting bloc and so important in this election season. We have a changing America who is more engaged politically, that we can use that to influence legislation and speak to the speakers about the amendment. Their question is, do they have that right? Like, are they looking at Gen Z as like a demographic in which Pauline Sabin in today's time would look at as like that emerging, very engaged group of individuals?
Very much so. I mean, she had a similar situation, in that women had still, even though they had been granted the vote on the national level in 1920, they still had not significantly registered and voted in the huge numbers that everybody thought they would. That like, oh my God, we gave them the vote. They're probably just going to rush to the polls and, do all this. But they really hadn't. And those that had voted were still following sort of the patterns of their husband, because they'd been living in houses hearing one view or thought. And it wasn't that they were slavish to their husband's doctrine. It was just like, that's the only thing they heard. But that's one of the other things that Pauline discovered was, and this is sort of relates to Gen Z and the myriad of ways that social media can interact, is radio had become such a big thing. When she was trying to build diversity in the organization, she's like, wives are at home, they're doing all this work at home, but they have the radio on in the background. We need to be on the radio. We need to be in those spaces and sort of interrupt whatever dialogue she might have with her husband by giving her some fresh information. And so she would just find ways to expand it. I think Gen Z is very similar. We keep thinking to ourselves that, they have all these interests that are very specific, and that, as any group of people who have been characterized as a group do, but they're still not registering and having the impact I think that a lot of us think they would by now. It's like, you're a massive block of people. So that is a huge opportunity to like tap in, and even at, obviously you're not going to show up at you may show up at a voter registration drive and just hand out a pamphlet or something. That's what Pauline did. It's like, we're registering voters, and at the same time, you might be interested in this, in this so-called issue that affects you. So I do see huge parallels.
For sure. And the Gen Z, I mean, we're all up against quite a bit, but they do see their future for sure at risk. Like, I think they have internalized the fear more than some other generations.
Well, and I think, whatever your thoughts are on how COVID was handled, and mask mandates and school closures and whatever, however you feel about it, that generation saw that in a very different way. That was a restriction on freedom. Now, you can always argue, yes, it was very much necessary, but coming out of that, some of that freedom wasn't given back. You know what I mean? In their minds, it's like they still feel held back. So to me, that's another entry point to, like, you know, you remember what it's like, now you know what it is, and it feels
Yeah,
different for them.
for sure. Awesome. Great question. Appreciate that. You did touch on this a little bit. Did Pauline and the movement have specific amendment language?
Um, yeah. It was basically just repeal of the 18th Amendment.
And did
That
that
was
come
it.
very early or?
Yes. I mean, it's really, that's why they have such a ridiculous title for the organization, is National Prohibition Repeal. She's like, that's all it is. That's all we're asking for. That, and the, we get, the people get to decide it. So they, yeah. And she, there were obviously the sub messages on why they thought it should be repealed, but the language that they wanted to see was never, I mean, when Blaine was kind of moving his amendment through the Senate and it was getting bounced back and forth and they were tweaking language, she would pop in and she would say, no, unless it says repeal, full repeal of national prohibition in the 18th Amendment, that's all I care about. I don't want any addendums or anything else on this, just that.
Something about keeping it simple, right?
Yeah. Well, people can understand it.
For sure. I think that's probably even more important in today's world.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we got Chris from Alabama. What is a good resource to find organizations in our states that would be beneficial to form a coalition with?
Oh, I mean, I probably don't know quite as much about those aspects. I don't know if that might be a better question, for you to answer, or someone else in your organization.
Yeah, I don't know, Chris, if there's like a specific area to go look for stuff, but not to sound too millennial here, but good old Google, honestly. Facebook is pretty good for finding groups in your area, especially some of the smaller grassroots organizations. Um, and then you can also, I tend to find quite a bit of events, also legislator events, which is important, on Facebook specifically. And then once you start following that stuff, it tends to get easier and easier as those things, that's how the machine wants it, right? All of a sudden, then you start getting more of that in your feeds, and it gets easier to attend events and find groups. But yeah, just literally Googling campaign finance reform groups in your state, um, good advocacy groups in your state, or organizing is definitely a keyword. That's one of the things we did for this year's workshop, was really try to bring more local community organizers to the workshop. So we looked at groups that we weren't familiar with that are actually currently already organizing so that we can learn from them for sure. Hope that helped.
Can I just throw in
Hopefully one day
also?
it's our website when it's every group in America supporting the effort, and then it'll be really easy to find.
Right.
Josh, can I throw in also the political parties and committees are also super helpful. I'm a member of my. I have bigger problems with the opposing party than my own, but I also have big problems with my party. But that hasn't stopped me from being a member of my local political committee and a delegate to the state committee next week. I'm heading up there and made lots of friendships with people who are involved in all kinds of other political efforts through that.
Sam, you want to keep going? You have some questions on here.
Yeah, I'm here and Sammy's here with me as well. The
Awesome.
YouTube audience can see us on Zoom. We're only voices. And Sammy, want to say
Hello.
hi? So, okay. Yeah, for my first question, I think was just probably a mistake on my part. I thought that the name of the organization originally was Reform and not Repeal. Was I just mistaken there, or?
Yes.
Okay, I appreciate it. I always enjoy being corrected. That's how you learn. Thank you, thank you. So there was also a woman that I'd read about, and I cannot for the life of me remember her name. But I was researching. There was an effort at the same time, and I was trying to find out if Pauline Sabin had any interaction with them or anything to do with it. But there was an effort to use the Article 5 convention process to get the amendment proposed, in addition to the Article 5 state convention process to get it ratified. That's what we're talking about at Wolfpack is the Article 5 proposing convention. And one of the big names behind there was Louis Cavalier. He's a state assemblyman from New York. First of all, do you know anything about that effort?
No, I don't. That name does not ring a bell. And
Okay.
I think, you know, everything I saw, they were focused solely on the state
Yeah.
conventions. And I think that had a lot to do with just Pauline's comfort
Hmm.
in the political realm.
Definitely.
She was a political animal and had been for so long. I think that's just what she knew. Plus, that was less adding yet another convention. I
Yeah.
think that was more confusing and complicating. And her message was always, let's keep this simple for people to understand in this process, especially for women who maybe until a week ago hadn't ever been engaged in any political movement of any kind.
Yeah, there was one woman who was involved in that effort that I can't remember her name, but you might recognize the description. Um, and if so, you probably know the story better than I do. Because she also testified before Congress and was she considered herself an ally of the movement. She was also an ally of Cavalier's. And she was kind of distanced from the movement because she had some kooky ideas that she testified about before Congress. I think a little more. I can't remember what it was exactly, but I think it was a little more sexual liberation than they were ready for in the early 1930s.
Mhm.
Do you remember who I'm talking about, or if I can't remember her name offhand?
Alice Paul, maybe.
Was it Alice
Is it-
Paul from the? She was all. No, I would have recognized Alice Paul because I know who she
Okay.
is.
Yeah. Boy, yeah, I'm
It's
drawing a blank.
possible it was Alice Paul, but that seems unlikely because yeah, Alice Paul. I talked about it in my talk earlier today. She was involved in several other
Okay.
women efforts.
Yeah, it's not ringing a bell. I mean, the only other woman I can ever think of who
I know
had,
she was from New York.
huh? Yeah, boy,
I'll find
trying to
it,
think
and
of some of her.
probably when I find it, I'll email you.
Yeah, please do.
Okay. Thanks. So yeah, you had mentioned Pauline Sabin had a constitutional expert. Who was that? I would really like to read their work.
I'll have to try and dig it out. Yeah,
Okay.
in the book, it was not a passing reference, but I didn't name him, so I'll have to.
Okay.
But I can take a look.
Because I know I've read every expert who's written on the Article 5 proposing convention from that time period.
Yeah.
There's a few of them. Orfield comes to mind, a few others from that time period. I've read a lot of the ones who wrote about the Article 5 ratification conventions, but I could not say with confidence that I'm familiar with anywhere close to all of them who talked about the Article 5 ratification conventions from that time. And I'd love to read more on that.
Okay.
Um,
And it may be there's a couple books I'll send you the names of, and it may be in there too.
okay. I know Brown wrote a compilation of all of the state convention laws and convention records, which was a really, really helpful primary source on that, which I really enjoyed that book. And one thing I got from that book, which I also mentioned in my talk earlier as part of an answer to a question, Arizona had an unusual provision in their Article 5 ratification law where they would, if a delegate ran away from their instructions, that delegate's vote would be invalidated and they would be replaced with an alternate who would vote as instructed. Do you have any idea where they got that idea from? I know some historical precedent where they might have gotten that idea from, but I have no idea if they actually got it from my historical precedent or if somebody else just came up with that idea.
I can't really answer that. I did not
Okay.
delve that deeply into the actual state conventions and each state's sort of provisions for,
Okay.
accommodating.
That idea has been copied more recently as part of laws governing the Electoral College, and now more recently delegates to an Article 5 proposing convention. And they all use that exact same language that came from the Article 5 ratification convention in Arizona. Let's see, was that? Oh yeah, I had a couple others. So how did Pauline Sabin hold her coalition together when they, in kind of the early years as they were building out the coalition? What did they do to prevent losses at the same time as they were building it out? Were they able to bank some wins? And if so, how did they do that at that time when they were still small?
A lot of it had to do um, with the educational approach. Um, it's again this sort of happy coincidence of, I don't know how you want to term it, but that since she's engaging women again who haven't been engaged in politics, their desire to learn about the system and how to be involved and how to do it um, uh, distinct from what their husbands might be saying or doing, seemed to really drive it. And at the same time, they held like again in this sort of pyramid, they held meetings all the time, and then they had regional directors, and Pauline would go see and like fire them up, and they'd, she'd be on the, a couple times she was on the movie newsreels, at the local theater, and they would like advertise it, and they would go see her, and it was almost like, she was inspiring them. And so it really was just sort of her will, the will of her administrators throughout this kind of hierarchy of organizations down to the neighborhood level, and really the will of these women to learn about the political process and be engaged, because they didn't feel that men were ever going to ask them to engage at that level or explain how the system worked or how they could have an impact. And so it was really their overriding desire, once they became involved, to just stick with it and own a piece of something and be a part of something.
That's awesome. I think that's kind of what we're trying to replicate here.
Mhm.
That's very inspiring. I got two more, and then I'll turn you over to Sammy for her questions. So you mentioned them working with other coalitions like labor and things like that. A lot of those groups had their own interests that were their primary interests, and while they agreed with prohibition reform, it wasn't their main issue. How did they hold the attention and get what they needed to get from those allies when the allies were sometimes like this was maybe a secondary or tertiary issue for them?
Right. Well, one, the key component, in any alliance was stressing again that the restrictions enforced upon them by the prohibition law and laws at the state level really imposed upon their freedoms, and that if they could take one freedom, they could take another. And certainly labor interests were constantly battling at this time for their civil rights, and trying to establish that they do have a right to bargain and to speak for themselves. And so on that level, she just played to that. And then the other thing would be, unless you have an overriding, when you go to the polls and vote, unless, this particular candidate is so objectionable to you because he's, a virulent opponent of unionism or worker rights or those kinds of things, please consider voting based upon whether or not, this guy would allow popular choice. And that was the other thing with these other groups is if they won't allow us to have a state convention and popular mandate, if you will, or vote on this issue, you're not going to get one on anything either. And so it serves us all to, pursue this process. But she always understood that in asking those questions, it's like, she was always respectful of, I get that you may have different interests or goals than we do. I'm asking you to consider where they meet and how what we're doing may influence you down the road based upon our success or failure. And if you have the opportunity, please support the candidates that are supporting this, because that means they're more open, perhaps, to allowing you the same, considerations when you're asking for less restriction upon yourselves.
I just want to add, I feel like that's such an important attribute of an organizer, being able to really get to the other person's issue and see the commonality between the two, and building solidarity in a conversation. Like that is some of the stuff, just learning briefly even from today and past about Pauline, that was like, all right, if she was around today, we'd be kicking it. We'd be hanging out. I'd be picking her brain.
Right.
Well, I mean, we have been picking the brain of Jane McAlevey, who is, in many ways, a modern Pauline Sabin. But we've attended her seminars several times, and like came up with our own version as well. By the way, wolf-pack.com/SBO to get our organizer training. It's coming up on Tuesday for the next several Tuesdays at 8. Yeah. Anyway, I have one more question, and this one kind of leads well into my last one, which was for legislators at either the state or the federal level, where maybe they were facing obstinate leadership, people whose votes they needed and weren't providing it. How did they exercise the people power that they had spent that time building how do they leverage that to actually force the hands of the legislators if they were unwilling for whatever reason, either personal opposition or because they had, were being lobbied by people on the other side or whatever reason?
A lot of it had to do with that idea of not phrasing the argument in terms of the actual issue of prohibition or its morality or its intent, but on the issue of, we're just asking you to allow the people to have a vote on it. And again, holding their feet to the fire on that issue of like, well, if you're not even going to allow us to vote on it, are you going to listen to us on anything else? And then whenever they would have those kinds of any kind of survey, they would publish it widely, especially in local newspapers, and say, here's what your local, here's what your district representative thinks. They don't want you to have a say in this. They don't want you to have a vote. And it'd just be very simple. It'd just be a tabulation. Here's who says they're willing to allow you to decide, and here's who says they don't want you to decide. And that had a lot of impact in flipping voting, to other people. Is like, that's a simple concept. Again, it doesn't, if they won't let me vote on this, what else are they not going to allow me a voice on? And they had a lot of success in flipping legislators who had said no, or for those who had said yes, in constantly reminding them in the lead up to elections that, remember what you said, that, you would allow this, especially when we get to a state convention, that you're going to like be responsive and get that thing set quickly and observe, the rules of selecting delegates and so on and so forth. And so they just kept hammering it. And because they had such a far-ranging and reaching organization, I mean, they had people in every single state capital who would just, at that level, would just go in and say, hey, you didn't support us, or you did support us, and we want to make sure you continue. So they just would put pressure on you. And as I said, they would advertise it widely and just say, these are guys that are not going to let you have a voice in this. And that seemed to carry a lot of resonance, especially with women who were first-time voters. It's like, you finally gave us a vote, but now you're going to tell me my vote doesn't matter because you won't let me have a say. And that carried a lot of weight with those women.
This gets me excited because when you talk about going to the capitals and putting pressure on, like before we went down the rabbit hole of organizing that led us to the stories and folks like Pauline Sabin, that's pretty much what we did, was the advocacy side of things, going to the Capitol, training our volunteers to literally be citizen lobbyists, to the point, John, where in committee speeches, I would tell volunteers to make sure they mention they're a volunteer, because many of the legislators just thought they were lobbyists.
Right.
They just didn't even know.
Represent.
Yeah, the problem was we did that without building the coalition first.
Yeah, we just didn't build the coalition first. That's why I'm getting excited about this, because we were good at the other stuff. Now, if we have the juice behind it with the people and the way that Pauline Sabin thought about the movement, growing it, yeah, it's exciting.
We were successful without a coalition until we had opposition.
Of a coalition.
Once we had opposition, then our lack of the grassroots first effort, even though we were all volunteers, we didn't have enough of them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to let Sammy ask some questions.
Awesome.
Okay.
I'll go on mute for Sammy.
Hello. Um, so since some of my questions are simple. Oh, did you have one last question?
No, I asked that.
Oh, okay. I wanted to ask, I guess when you were speaking earlier, you were saying how they needed to, as soon as like the bill got put out in March of 1933, and how they needed to basically like act fast and like communicate to everyone throughout the country to get like the word out. So they had 7 years to do all that. You said that they kind of had to like be secretive about it, or they wanted to do it so that opposition, like they wanted to be quick about it so opposition couldn't interfere. Do you know like
How'd they do that?
yeah, and like how secretive did they have to be, or did they have to be secretive? Like
No, they weren't secretive at all, because they wanted their allies to be with them at the same time, like pressing and saying, it's just Wamper who's telling you that it's time to do this now and we want it to happen. It's like, don't forget, we're allied with these 8 other or whatever it was organizations. We're talking about masses of voters. And again, these people want to hold on to their jobs. And so they're motivated by those kinds of numbers that are presented to them. And Wamper had been laying the groundwork for years on sort of alerting, identifying those legislators who at the state level who would be most helpful to them in just getting that to a vote, within the legislator to establish this convention. And in some state legislatures, they were like, yeah, let's have them do it right away. They're never going to get organized enough to get this done. And then we won't have to worry about it because they'll, get crushed. And so some state legislatures were happy to accommodate because they thought that they didn't appreciate the depth and breadth of the organization and its alliances and how much work they had done in talking to prospective delegates that would then go to these conventions and how ready they were for it. And so some states were kind of like, sure, go ahead, let's have a state convention. You're going to get, creamed kind of thing. And in other cases, they just made it very clear that wouldn't you rather get this out of your way now and you'll have elections again in a year. Do you want to do this in 1934? You want to have to come back and say, I didn't allow them to have a state convention, or I postponed it, or, again, that idea that you're not allowing us our voice on any level, whether it was delaying setting up a convention or simply opposing the amendment itself, just hammering away at those things, knowing that these people don't want to be voted out of office, and stressing to them again the breadth of the organization. And some, like I said, some state legislators and legislatures is not really understanding how big this movement was.
were they focused that on something else at the time? Like,
I'm sorry, what?
Or I guess were they was there anything else happening at the time that they were distracted by that made them kind of aloof to how big it was?
Oh yeah. I mean, they were, in
Great question.
1932,
Yeah, right.
yeah, in 1932, 25% of the population is still out of work. And so this seems like a trifle to a lot of legislators. It's like, I can't believe we're dealing with this when, we've got all these people out of work and we're trying to institute social programs and trying to, do all this kind of helping of people. And at the same time, there was a massive wave in 1932 elections at the local, state, and federal level. I mean, Democrats, which were not the party of prohibition, are rolling into offices. And so at every level, because people are just sick of what's gone on under the Hoover administration and Republican state legislatures, just sort of ignoring this problem that's right in front of them. And so that was also a pretty big factor in getting these things to move quickly. And at the same time, it's like, yeah, let's give them the state convention, because once we set a date, we don't have to be involved as the state legislature. We can go back to dealing with these really big issues, what they viewed as much bigger and more important issues.
And then my other questions are kind of basic, like I can look them up. But one burning question is, was there a state that they had the most issue getting the bill passed in? And like how many times did the bill have to get edited, sort of thing?
So once it was sent out to the states, there's no editing. It's a take it or leave it proposition. When it was bouncing around the U.S. Congress and Senate, there were like 2 or 3 things, and they kept trying to water it down by making it replacing the word repeal with reform, and that wasn't going to stand because reform came with no description of what that would entail. It's like that would still require more legislation and so on and so forth. And there were other little things like, are we going to give them 7 years, or we're going to adjust the period, and little things like that. But once it was sent to the states for their ratification, there were no changes to the amendment. It's like you either take it or you don't. There's a period allowed for debate, and then you vote on it. I mean, the conventions did not last long. I mean, it was basically like, sort of the national party conventions of today, just a couple days. Like we come in, we have a day.
Delaware was 45 minutes.
What's that?
Delaware was 45 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like some of them went really fast. And so, there was...
You make an amendment, a 1-2 word question, like...
And everyone's pledged on how they vote in advance. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know pretty well based on the delegate election, how it's going to go.
Utah took a little longer because they called in National Public Radio. I actually have a picture, you've probably seen, of the convention floor in Utah when they passed it. It was published in a newspaper at the time that I found in an archive online.
Nice.
They called in National Public Radio, which in 1933 was not a super easy process to broadcast a nationwide radio event, but they understood how monumentous it would be, so they delayed the convention by several hours to bring in the radio.
I didn't go into the individual states, but everybody did it on the first convention. It wasn't like they met and it was denied and they came back later. Everything happened the first time through.
Seamless. I wanted to piggyback on what you were saying and Sammy's question there. You said that when it was bouncing around in Congress, there were attempts to water it down, which, I rolled my eyes and laughed, because when we get to that point, that's almost certainly going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Did Pauline Sabin's movement play a role in making sure it didn't get watered down? I think I know the answer, but I hope I'm right.
Yes. I mean, first of all, they sort of like any lobbying group, if you will, they had people there, and they would stay in close contact. And they also had their membership just send telegrams constantly, like just, and again, they knew who they could rely on. They had established, relationships or sort of dossiers, on, we know how this guy's going to vote, not vote. We know who we can rely on. We know who we may need to put pressure on, that kind of thing. And that's ultimately, it was those contacts that brought it back to just this basic, repeal, instead of like, okay, we're not monkeying with this anymore. Because Blaine, and they also had this huge advantage in Blaine, who had never really had much association with them. I mean, they always counted him as on their side, but he wasn't like, in contact with them a lot. But the fact that he was a lame duck, he didn't have to worry about getting reelected. He had already lost. So this was sort of like his last hurrah, I'm going to leave my stamp on kind of thing. Because it's sort of like, now I can really speak my mind since I'm getting out of here. So that was kind of a big bonus that they hadn't expected.
Nice.
Can I just follow up on that real quick? When Josh told me after he talked to you, John, that he had told you that we don't have amendment language ourselves that we're currently proposing, and we get that question a lot. Sammy asked me that question during the lunch break, in fact. Why we don't, and we talk about it, and I think that it's the right decision. But what Josh told me that when he told you that, you thought that was a good idea right off the bat, and you're one of the very few people who did that I've heard not have to be convinced of that. Uh, can you tell me what your thoughts are on that and why that was your reaction?
On specific language.
Yes.
Well, I think this you're in a unique position, because you're not necessarily responding to an existing law so much as this, series of court decisions. And so it's not as if you're just asking for something that exists to be removed. It's sort of asking for a control to be placed on something, which is, again, that's the hardest thing in dealing with actual amendments is, other than the 18th, the Prohibition Amendment, every other amendment grants a right or a freedom or a protection of something. And so crafting that language is going to be, I mean, that's obviously, on the Sabin model, that's what you're trying to do, is promote this as a protection of a right or a freedom. And so in your respect, you're trying to obviously limit campaign finance and reform how it's worked, and trying to find the balance between presenting the damage that is done to rights and freedoms by the current system, but not being able to point to a specific law is going to take some crafting.
Okay. Uh, Thank you. I did also just want to say, in the last 10 years, of all the books I read, I think there's the four that I've learned the most from are Constitutional Brinksmanship by Russell Kaplan, Ratification, The People Debate the Constitution by Pauline Mayer, um, uh, Civil Resistance, What Everyone Should Know by Erica Chenoweth, and also your book. And I really
Oh,
appreciate
thank
that.
you. Wow, because that's pretty heady company you threw me in there. A lot more scholarly than my little book. But thank you.
All right. Does anybody have any last questions? Sam, Sammy, anybody in the audience? All right. I am hearing and seeing none. Yeah, some thank yous for sure. I really appreciate this, John. This was fantastic. I feel like it's safe to say we have a awesome Pauline Sabin expert ally that we can reach
We
out
do.
to and communicate with. And yeah, as we grow this thing, any advice you have, we will definitely listen. Because yeah, we're not in it just to be in it. We had some really hard conversations around the pandemic about our organization and the future, and the ultimate goal was not to give up and to honestly will through it, because there really isn't an effort to build a movement and build solidarity and organize Americans towards a collective goal, which I think we all fundamentally agree is somewhat the cancer of our representative democracy right now. It affects so many issues, and yeah, we got quite a bit of work, but this was motivating for sure. So I really appreciate you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I'm very much on your side in this. To me, it's just, and I think that's going to be the strength of your movement as it grows, is that the argument is very obvious.
Yeah,
It's the solution is the more work part of it for you guys to
and the
decide
trust.
exactly
I
what
think
that looks like.
I think trust right now is the number one thing to really focus on, because to me it's what breaks down most communication and what you see going on in the world. There's just a lack of trust. But
Mhm.
yeah, trust will definitely help, and you can only do that through conversations. So definitely appreciate this one today for sure.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, I bid you adieu, and I hope you have the great rest of your weekend.
Thanks. Same to y'all.
Thank you. All right, everybody. Well, we're gonna take. I guess we could take a 5-minute break. Tim, Mark, you guys there? Got Timothy. Let's make Timothy a co-host. Tim, you should be able to come on.